Hello and welcome to the What Dogs Have Taught Me podcast. I'm your host, Julie Hart. My guests and I explore a variety of subjects based on what dogs have taught us, but it's not totally limited to dog training specifically. Dogs affect us in a much bigger way.
Today's podcast features my dad, Kerry Brock, and I wanted to have him on here because he has taught me not to listen to limitations that other people may tell me or society may try to tell me. And it's allowed me to have some confidence to try things that are out of the box, whether in dog training or in life. I've done things like build a shed and, training feral dogs to be pets and all kinds of things. And honestly, if someone tells me I can't do something, it kind of makes me go, oh yeah, watch. So I kind of get that from my dad, and I hope you guys can enjoy his point of view in this podcast about how he sees limitations as opportunities.
If you'd like to learn about what I do, please visit my website, hearttoheartcanine.com, HART2, heartcanine.com. I have many learning opportunities, especially for online fearful and feral dog rehabilitation and training. I've been working with fearful and feral dogs for many years, and I have learned that traditional training methods often fail to address the unique needs of fearful and feral dogs. Learn how to help these dogs rehab, train, and thrive by visiting fearfuldogtraining.com.
As I was thinking about dog training and the dogs I work with, I realized that a lot of people put limitations on dogs and what they can respond to, what works, and how far they can progress. And sometimes this is to the detriment of the dog through isolation or allowing the dog to remain in fear. I think one thing we need to do as trainers is to question the status quo and limitations put on dogs by other people and training methodologies. Dogs don't know about limits and therefore do not limit themselves. Some of my lack of limitations in rehabilitating dogs comes from not knowing what the limitations should be. I didn't know they existed. It wasn't until recently I started reading other people's books about fearful and feral dogs and realized how many limits others place on dogs. So when I was thinking about this and asking myself who I knew to interview that has questioned limits or simply ignored them, the answer was my dad. So my dad is here with us today. His name is Kerry Brock. How old are you now, Dad? 77?
I am now 77. Yes, and proud of it.
So my dad is well known in our family as being able to beat any of us in almost any physical activity at 77 years of age. Also, he has, I think, constantly kind of went past boundaries that other people may have put on you, or maybe you even put on yourself. We'll get into that a little bit more. I actually might learn some things about you because I don't know a whole lot about your career, which is funny.
Yeah, well, we attempted to keep, work and other life a bit separate, and I think we were successful at that mainly.
So a little background about what I do know about my dad and why he, I think, has exceeded many social limitations that would have been put on him, as he was born into poverty, I'm assuming, in a coal mining camp in Kentucky in a little town called Black Star, right?
That's correct.
And so that obviously right away puts a lot of limitations. I mean, obviously, if you're born into an environment like that, you have less advantages than someone born into an environment like I was, right? Even though we weren't wealthy by any means, we were definitely better off when I was born than you were financially. Explain a little bit about what that was like in the coal mining camp. I mean, I know you had like one metal cup, and that was your cup you had to use. But what else was going on there?
Okay, so, it's interesting, your introduction about dogs. So I can tell you that basically I was like a dog relative to limitations. When you're in the coal mining camp, you don't know what the outside world is. I didn't place any limitations on myself. I just was there. And for me, there was fine at the time because I had a great mom and a great dad. 4 years then later, I had a sister. We existed in that environment. I really didn't think of limitations for me. And I must say that I never remember my mom and dad placing any limitations on me. It's not like we talked about the subject. It's not one of the things that you normally would even think of. Now, of course, there were always negatives and there were always positives. I really, generally speaking, remember the positives outweighing the negatives. As a kid, I played, I enjoyed life, even up until the time that we, came to the quote big city. I really didn't have that many limitations. Looking back on it, I can't think of anything that would have made me fearful about doing something, going forward, playing with this or trying to fix that. So that's my take on limitations. As a kid, I don't think I was like your dog. I didn't know they existed, so I just did what I could do and what the society I was in at the time would allow me, sometimes to the limits, but they were the positive side of the limits that I felt, not the negative side.
Yeah, I mean, when you're a kid and you're in a situation you don't know there's anything else, I suppose.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And particularly in that environment where, remember, at that time, there were no TVs. I mean, you had a radio, but, you got the country stations. So it was your same environment. There was no internet. In other words, the communications were isolated. You were in a village. In today's world, you can live in a village and you're still in the world. That is a significant difference. And maybe one of the reasons why limitations may be more apparent today than at my time.
And I think a lot of the limitations are kind of self-inflicted. I mean, like I didn't know how we grew up. We weren't like mom used to cut paper napkins in half to save money, right? Like,
Right.
and I never felt any less than any other kid, probably. But again, like I didn't know any different because there wasn't this like worldwide exposure and seeing all this stuff on the internet of what other people have.
But not only that, but I think also the focus was on the positive things. The napkin thing is an interesting byproduct, but it's actually, I see the napkin thing as a positive response to the situation that allows you to feel better about what you're doing and why you're doing it. And that's one of the other issues of looking at things different ways. The limitations are opportunities. It's your choice which of those opportunities you take, but very seldom are limitations an absolute positive for sure thing.
And isn't there a story about Grandpa Willis? This is my great grandpa, like running water to a house or something that other people didn't have.
Well, Mike, in fact, one of the most influential people in my life was my grandfather, Willis, yes. And that's on my mother's side. Yeah, Grandpa Willis worked in the mines as well. He was a smart fellow and a clever fellow. So he worked himself up to a position where he was laying timber, which was paid a little bit more. But my grandmother was also a hard worker. So by scrimping and saving, they got this little acre of land, which they turned into, a farm. And my grandfather would tackle any need. Running this water was a good example. Sure, we only had one well and we only had one pump, and that's where my cup was, out by the pump. When you wanted some water, you went out and got it, or you brought it in a jug. But that was grand because most people had to go to a central pump somewhere and bring it home in a big jug. So it's all relative. Yeah, my grandfather was, he would tackle anything. I remember he and I trying to figure out how to build a rock wall and how to run electricity when he finally got it to the various places in the house. I mean, we couldn't afford people to do it. And to be honest, there weren't that many people around that did it. You sort of either had to do it for yourself or you didn't do it. And again, there are limitations, no, opportunities. And he would tackle those as opportunities and not let him be convinced that he couldn't do it.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I'm wondering, like if that's kind of a family tradition, that mindset.
Well, I certainly think we all know that part of a person is based on environment, and part of that person is based on heredity and other aspects. And sure, I believe that those strong foundations influenced who I am, what my opportunities were, and how I saw those opportunities. And other people in a different environment could not be as fortunate as that.
I should say. And then your family moved to Cincinnati, decided coal mining wasn't for you, right?
Well, when my father worked in the coal mines are a strange situation because the companies would use a coal vein until it was more difficult to mine, and then they would just move the coal mining camp to another mountain. And so, ironically, as a young family, we would move from cold camp to cold camp. But after I was just like 3 or 4 years old, my mom and dad would have a little business on the side. They've had a grocery store once, a country grocery store, a gas station with one pump, of course, a little garage, a restaurant alongside the road, a little diner type thing. So we had this thing on the side, and that allowed them to accumulate a little bit of money that allowed them to be divorced of the coal mines. We lived outside of the mines after I was about 5 in small houses and, shacks and things like that. But it was more comfortable than in the mines. It basically allowed them to finally move to Cincinnati, yes, and try to exist in a typical urban environment.
And I think Grandpa got a job. Was Sears his first job, or did he have that gas station?
At first, he tried a gas station. It didn't work so well. He survived and had success, but it really wasn't something that allowed us a continuous income. So he started to work at Sears. And remember, my father's father died in the coal mines in an accident. When that happens, they allow the eldest son to have his job at his current pay rate. In other words, sort of replace him as the earner, right? My dad started mining coal at 13 years old.
Okay, so I have a couple questions, and you may not know the answers. And this is just my own curiosity. I may not even put this part in the podcast. But so when your grandpa died, did they train Grandpa to take his job? And is that
yeah. I mean, it's not a complicated thing.
Right.
Coal mine. Okay. I mean, you go in with a pick and a shovel and sometimes in coal that you can't even stand up in, right? And you mine it, and you get paid based on the tonnage that your crew does that shift. And you get paid in script, which you can only use at the grocery store and other places inside the coal mine,
in the camp.
A camp. It's a strange environment, and it's primarily broken today. In other words, it's been sophisticated and improved significantly. But in those days, that was the way it was.
Wow. Okay, so, and when Grandpa started at Sears, I think Sears was still the kind of company that offered like retirement and all kinds of things.
Yes, they had a good benefit program. He started out selling paint. He eventually worked himself up to the manager of the paint department. It allowed him to provide a pretty good living. My mother also worked. She had a more flexible job. She was into physical therapy. Not that she was a physical therapist or anything. She was simply a person who helped in the physical therapy department at the local hospital. But it gave her some flexible hours. And with her working and my father as well, they provided it for us beautifully. Sure, looking back on it, and comparing it to others, it was a minimalist environment, but we were happy. We never needed anything really more than that. And it allowed us to be in a bigger environment, and I think a more opportunistic environment than the coal mining area in Appalachia.
When you were saying that you don't remember grandma and grandpa telling you, like, you can't do this and you can't do that for whatever reason. I don't remember ever being told that as a kid either. I don't remember anyone saying like, oh, you can't build so-and-so because you don't know how to use the tools, or you can't grow a garden because you don't know how, or, you can't do this because you're a girl, right? Like,
for sure.
I don't, I don't remember any of that. And I think I do hear, parents, of course, when I had kids, parents saying things like that to their children. And I think it's unfortunate because it puts limitations on them. And I don't know if that's because the parent's afraid the kid will fail, or the parents maybe don't know how to do it themselves, or what that is exactly.
And the other strange thing about it, when the only way is up,
right,
it maybe makes it a little easier not to question it. What's the downside risk of trying something different when you don't have much to risk?
Right. You got nothing to lose.
Exactly. Let's say your father was a very successful brain surgeon and very wealthy. Well, it might be difficult to figure out what you'd be afraid that you couldn't meet those standards or something. But right. It's a complex thing, and I think it depends upon the environment and the personalities involved. That's my story, and I don't profess to actually be an expert in other people's stories.
No, I just find it interesting, as the more I'm exposed to other people's experiences, that I realize how much mine was very supportive, if that makes sense. So,
yes.
we did all kinds of crazy stuff, right? I remember you building some brick walkway and Penway at our house on Penway.
Uh-huh.
And I don't know how old I was then. I had to be under 5. And then we do, speaking of rock walls, right? We did stuff like took a trailer to some creek and put a bunch of rock on it and took it home and made a wall. And we didn't have any training in these things, right? Except like professional training. We didn't really know how. And at the time, there wasn't an internet to look it up.
Right. You couldn't ask YouTube how to do it. Yeah. But for both of those, I remember you being in there, sometimes complaining, but not so much so, slathering into concrete or just, raking the sand or doing whatever you could do. You were always active and interested in what was happening.
Yeah. When you decided to go to college and things, what did Grandma and Grandpa think about that?
They encouraged me. I didn't feel pushed, and they were okay with me doing it. Now, a lot of this stuff was like a mystery to them.
Right.
And the further I got along, the more mysterious it was.
Yeah.
But I can't, that's my best thing. I felt like they encouraged me, but they didn't push me. They never seem to be disappointed. Generally speaking, like I said, if your only way is up, then you have an advantage in some ways. Yeah, the college thing was circumstantial a bit. It had to do with the fact that, as I mentioned, my mom and dad always had these little businesses on the side. So I've always, as you have, tinkered with things along the way. And so by the time I got finished high school, I was really good in math and sciences. I got a little scholarship, and that's what allowed me to go to it was a community college type thing at the time, and enroll in a co-op college program. I worked 3 months and went to school 3 months. So with all of that and working at a little restaurant job, I could afford the education to get an associate's degree in engineering. But I did really well, second in my class. And so I got a really good job offer from DuPont, and that allowed me and your mother to move to the East Coast. And that's basically what sort of started some of my career. It ended up that co-op job while I was in college also played a critical role later in my career. So that's how the college thing happened. It really was not a planned path by me. It was more of a evolving path that presented itself, and I just took advantage of it.
And you and Mom got a dog before I was born named Clyde.
We did, yes. Mm-hmm. Shortly before you were born, actually, yeah.
But he was what? He was a year old when I was born or something, right?
Yeah. Uh-huh. Right.
And I remember Clyde was a little frustrating for you sometimes.
Let's put it this way. I was not the knowledgeable and patient dog trainer that you are. That's as kindly as I can put it. And of course, you have to remember, that was years ago, right? So
Right.
The whole thinking about dogs and how they fit into society, and particularly how they fit into, cities. We didn't pick up after our dog, for example. Okay, so things have really evolved a lot over time. So, but yes, I was definitely not, I did not have your qualities relative to Clyde, but he was a wonderful dog. He was one of your life companions.
Yeah. Yeah, he was always, I never remember him being a mean dog except to Elvis down the street.
Right. Uh-huh.
Which probably both were unneutered males, I'm guessing.
Yeah, probably. Yes, until later. I think we eventually did neuter Clyde because he just got, well, he always was difficult, but not difficult from a standpoint of meanness but just he was an adventuresome dog. He liked to be out, he liked to do things, and he liked to be himself. Well, and to be honest, I couldn't have too much anxiety with that routine because I was a lot like him, come to think of it. So, I was a very forgiving owner from that point of view.
He was probably out trying to find some females to hook up with.
Maybe. Well, that wasn't me, but it was certainly part of his genre, yes.
That's probably why he was so adventuresome. Clyde would get out a lot for everyone listening. He always tried to escape out the front door, I think. And sometimes
anywhere he could escape, he would escape. Yeah. You and I have built many a fence to keep that dog in. And we've developed, as you may remember, some runs, on wires with cables and various other things, various other creations that allowed him to enjoy the outside without us losing him permanently.
Yeah, which of course now, which is kind of funny that the cable that he had that he could run around the yard with offered him it wasn't cruel by any means. I never thought he had quite a large reign, but now that would be definitely frowned upon, but it did keep him in the yard. It's funny how that thought process has changed.
Exactly.
Well, we couldn't really afford to build a 8-foot fence around the property. So that was actually something that worked.
Yeah.
But I do remember Clyde getting out a lot, and sometimes he'd come back if we said, like, you want to go to grandma's, he'd go to the car.
Yeah.
Really like going to grandma's house. It's funny. But yeah, Clyde was a good dog. But he had his own photo album, so obviously he was well loved.
Oh, yes.
So after you went to college, I mean, you kind of moved up the corporate ladder, and we moved a lot. So I'm assuming you got better job offers when we moved.
Yeah. You know, if I look at my career, I see it as three different phases, actually. The first phase was my development, which means what jobs I had, what experiences I collected, which opened up windows for other experiences. And so there were a few key areas. But one was this ability of this prior tinkering and then good in sciences and math. And the other was creativity. In other words, and I started in my own little lab on the East Coast. And I was lucky enough, I invented a couple of things and got a couple of patents. And that got me a lot of attention as a very young person. At this point, I was 20 years old. DuPont offered me, which was my employer at the time, offered me some development classes. And so in the afternoons and weekends, I'd take these classes, both at colleges and at the company itself. Then, the issue came up that your mother was pregnant with you, and we decided to move back to Cincinnati. I contacted that employer that I had as a co-op, which happened to be General Electric.
Wow.
And General Electric's large jet engine division was in Cincinnati and is still. And that's who I had worked for. They welcomed me back. They needed me at the time because they were in the process of finishing the key results for a jet engine that would be used in Vietnam. So there was a lot of pressure to achieve certain things. There again, I was fortunate enough to very quickly develop a couple of processes that allowed them to solve some critical problems with that engine. And that provided me exposure to their human resources department and their development programs. So in addition to then working, and many times the third shift, so that I could attend college during the day. So I continued on it, and they paid for me to basically get my Bachelor of Science in mechanical and electronic engineering, and eventually my MBA. In the meantime, they gave me all kinds of neat assignments on special needs. So I was able to see a lot of the businesses and participate in them at a very young age. Basically, for 10 years, I spent with General Electric. And you may remember we moved around a few times then because they had issues with some medical systems. So we moved to Milwaukee area for a while. But after 10 years with them, I happened to be attending one of their development classes that's sort of like the book, What Color is Your Parachute?
Right.
Which basically allows you to look at who you are and what you want to be. Of course, by then, I was basically an individual contributor at a fairly high level, solving these problems as the company needed. So I concluded from that course that, I like to try my hand at small businesses and medium-sized businesses. Luckily, I had a friend who put me onto a small company. And so then for the next phase of my career, I worked for small companies. All the experience that I had at DuPont and GE, I could apply to these companies. And it was like magic. And it allowed them to excel and allowed me to be part of that. And it was way fun. And you're right. That also provided me exposure then to what headhunters, recruiters, right? And so constantly, as I would sort of finish one assignment, somebody would give me a call and with an opportunity. And many times those opportunities were fabulous. They allowed me some diversity. In other words, I could move from one particular type of industry to another. I could do exciting things at companies and very quickly, became like the president or CEO of these companies, focused primarily on high technology, mechanical and electronic things. So that's sort of how it happened. In my mid 40s, I decided that I would stop working. And there were some other consequences that led to that, but all of them ended up being opportunities. And so I did. And I had planned on absolutely doing nothing because I had enough confidence that something would happen, but I hadn't planned it or hadn't tried to organize it. But what happened was my competitors of prior jobs, as well as some of the people I'd worked with previously, started asking me to help them. Third phase of my career basically was consulting at a high level on specific problems at companies that both I knew and didn't know, and also participating in some board of director assignments. And that basically allowed me just to work maybe 3 or 4 months out of the year. And the rest of the time, my goal was to enjoy my life and enjoy the world. And I did that really well. I must say. And so I stopped that third phase of my career at 70 years old. And I dropped all of my board of director assignments and all that, and have been really retired since then. I mean, I think, retired before then, but those are the phases of my career.
You just said, "Oh, I'm not working anymore. Something will come up." I mean,
yeah. I mean, I had at that point, I had enough money to exist, not enough to live my whole life yet, but yes, it's basically it. I had enough confidence that something would come up. I had enough optimism that something would come up. It was an unusual timing. I mean, I didn't time it. It just happened.
Right.
And so I just, as many times actually in my career, I just took the risk of taking the opportunity. Lots of times it's about saying yes.
Right.
To something instead of worrying about too long and saying no.
Yeah. And I think, I've read a couple books throughout the years, like Celestine Prophecy. You remember that book?
Yeah. I know it very well.
That book is about taking opportunities that are presented to you, right? Maybe I would have done it anyway, but I think after reading that book, I was like, I should just take opportunities. I should explore them and not be afraid, because, when we were talking about doing this podcast, you said, like, what's the worst that can happen? Like, it's not like you do these things without thinking about them. Actually, you're kind of an over planner in many respects. You assess the risk appropriately, I think. And that allows you to maybe take the opportunities. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think that's well said. Yes, you need to do it responsibly, obviously, and particularly in today's world when there's lots of people out there waiting to take advantage of you. So you need to be maybe even more careful in today's world than I needed to be in mine. But of course, and you need to consider risk not only for yourself but for your family and all the other things. And see, at that point, I also only had risk for myself to worry about.
Right.
And so it made it easier from that perspective. You guys were independent and well off and the family. So it was just me. That made it easier, obviously.
Yeah.
But many of those times I can remember, when the recruiter would call So I had two choices, either say no or yes.
Right.
Now, of course, I would investigate it, as you say. And yes, when I investigated the risk, I did it pretty thoroughly. It was pretty easy for me because by then I had so many experiences piled up that I felt comfortable in doing it. But many times, it was taking a risk. It was saying yes. But I do agree. I think lots of times things present themselves, and it feels right to say yes.
To bring that back to dogs, because this is kind of a dog-centric podcast.
Right.
The dogs I work with, like you said, there's nowhere to go but up, right?
Good point. Good point.
They are at rock bottom and honestly at risk, like their lives are at risk.
Exactly.
I don't feel that kind of pressure anymore because the shelter I work with knows how to rehab them too, but when I got into the feral dogs, I mean, that was the other option pretty much. So I had a lot of motivation to try things. We had kind of a time limit. The shelter doesn't have, a lot of money or space to spend on dogs. And I figured, well, I might as well try, right? Like I might as well try these things and see how they work. And so it was a lot of experimentation, which I think you probably did tinkering, right?
Yeah, of course.
We've done a lot of experimentation together over the years.
Yes.
On various like remodeling bathrooms or taking apart cars and all kinds of stuff.
Right.
And I'm glad to say my son tinkered a lot too.
Yes, and is still tinkering. I mean, he spent forever doing that that sort of greenhouse thing, but he got it working. And yeah, you can be proud, I think, of both of your kids. Both of them are creative, and it's obvious by Sedona's renderings and other things that she is creative in her own way.
Yes. I don't want to leave out my daughter. It's just more obvious that Rowan was taking apart cameras and figuring out how they worked and soldering things together when he was like 12. And, he kind of made a mess in the garage, but my limit on him was as long as it's in the garage, you can do what you want,
Yes.
pretty much. Going back to the dogs, and just having this background of like trying things and maybe they don't always work, but then figuring it out, I think helped me figure out some of these dogs. And
well, there's a favorite saying I have on that subject that it was Edison. Edison basically invented light bulbs,
right.
And that's how he got started. Okay. Well, it took Edison 2,300 tries until he figured out that tungsten was the right element to use for the filament. The point is this: failing is not a problem.
Right.
It's not trying it is the issue. And if it's important to you, failing 3 or 4 times before you reach success is not a bad ratio. As Meatloaf would say, 2 out of 3 ain't bad.
God, Meatloaf. I mean, you have to fail to figure out what works sometimes,
Absolutely.
So I was in karate class last night. Interesting. Well, it is interesting that I'm doing karate at this age, but
I think it's fabulous that you're doing it. I find it, I think it's wonderful. I think it's great.
But I would recommend everyone with kids to find a sensei like this guy and put your kids in these classes because, I mean, he's kind of tough. He's not all warm and fuzzy, but for example, we had to pair up and do a kata together in front of the class last night. And I'm pretty comfortable working with dogs in front of clients or even in a workshop setting, but this made me nervous, right? Because it was different. And I'm not, I just started, like I'm not great at it. And the first time, me and the partner, we both messed up. And one of the reasons was because when we were practicing, I was on his right. And then when we tried to demonstrate, I was on his left. And it just threw me, which is such a dog thing, right? Like dogs are very particular about, they learn habits about where they're supposed to be placed and jump in the car when they're on your right and not your left and all kinds of things. So anyway, we didn't do so well the first time. And then the sensei was like, well, who wants to try again? And we both raised our hands. And the second time we killed it, right?
Oh, great. Uh-huh.
And he was, what did he say? He said, failing isn't the problem. Making a mistake isn't a problem. He's like, never be afraid to make a mistake in front of me. He's like, if you don't learn from the mistake, then that's the problem, right?
Uh-huh. Right.
So anyway, it's funny how all these things are kind of repeating similar messages in my life right now. It's interesting, but I mean, for kids, I think that's a fantastic message. Don't be afraid to fail. Do you remember when I was teaching those art classes for like elementary school kids for a few years?
Yes.
In my basement.
Yes.
Some of the kids would come and they would be very worried about what I wanted them to do.
Correct.
Or doing the wrong thing. It's art. So I tried to tell them, like, look, it's art. There's no wrong answer, right? There's also no right answer, really. You just do what you want within the assignment, of course, whatever supplies we had.
Right.
And I'm hoping that helped those kids a little bit to be more, what's the worst that will happen, right? We waste a piece of paper and it doesn't look so great. And there's a saying in the art world, right? You got to make a lot of really bad art before you make good art.
Yeah, there you go. Uh-huh.
So it's kind of like the Edison thing, right? He had to try.
Exactly like the Edison thing.
2000 sometimes. And then the other interesting thing that happened recently was this whole granola thing.
Oh, yeah. Uh-huh.
Which I found fascinating. Just a kind of a interesting thing about human behavior is I make my own granola, right? And you came to visit and you're like, oh, how do you make the granola? What's the recipe? And I said, well, there really isn't one. I kind of use whatever I have. And so I kind of gave you a very loose recipe of basically a list of things I put in it.
Uh-huh.
And then you took that back to your house and you had a granola making party, right?
Yeah, well, I did, I did my granola a couple of different times and it was fun. And I really enjoyed just putting things that I thought would go together. And, this looks about the right number of chocolate chips to go into this, that kind of thing, I thought it was way fun. Yes. And so I had a granola making party, invited a few of our friends. And what I discovered was, generally speaking, they wanted to walk away with how many ounces of chocolate chips should I put in my granola? And of course, I had no idea, number one, how many ounces I put in. And number two is, for me, it would take all the fun out of it,
right.
Of creating something. So now I have the opportunity to create something new every time I make granola. And I did have one out of the 7 finally tell me that she felt comfortable in making her granola now in a similar way. So anyway, yes, it's people do like predictability. People do like repetitive behavior. It makes them feel comfortable. Now, I think dogs do also to some point, right? They enjoy doing things that they feel they know what's happening and what's going to happen. I sense humans are the same. Now, obviously, I sometimes think different than normal. But for me, this is an interesting example of opportunities and just being able to take them.
I mean, the risk of making a wrong batch of granola is pretty small.
Yeah, maybe $10 at max.
Max. And maybe, I don't know, it doesn't even take that long, right? 15 minutes. And
Well, when I make granola, it turns into an affair. um, I take my time doing it because I enjoy it, and I usually make enough to last me a month or more.
right.
So yeah, but you're right. It's a delightful little time spent, in the kitchen and with the oven, maybe hour and a half for me.
The desired outcome isn't to throw it away, right?
Hmm.
Uh, and I've never had that happen where it was so bad I couldn't eat it, but there was better batches and not so good batches. But if people are afraid to experiment with granola, then what else? Like those are the kind of limitations I find very interesting. Um, and why? And then how does that translate into a larger picture? And for me, there's very established like dog training methods, right? Of things that are pretty sure they'll have some effect, right? And positive effect towards what your goal is in
Hmm.
helping the dog and the person.
Right.
But one of the reasons I love working with dogs and the owners is that no two is alike, right? And you're always going to get something that doesn't fall within those parameters where that recipe is going to work. So you might have to alter the recipe a little bit, and sometimes you have to kind of just scrap the recipe and start building a new one. I find it interesting how this all can relate, to helping dogs, and I imagine lots of other things like your career, right? You have an expression that you've been born lucky, right?
Yeah, I do. I use that expression often. And
And
for me, I think luck is a real thing,
right,
and we have to give some credit to luck.
yes,
Um, I think it. I think luck can multiply your efforts. Now, if you aren't standing at a door, you can't open the door.
right,
So the question is, how much is the effort getting to the lucky part? You might want to say, but unless you have that effort, unless you have that zeal to do something a little different and open a door, then you're not going to be in front of it. And if you're not in front of it, you can't give luck a chance to be there.
yeah,
So I think we can give some credit to luck, but we have to. It's like, you know, if you give total luck to your ship coming in when you win the lottery, so what you do is you invest $100 a week in the lottery. I think that's not appropriate way for luck to show its face.
right,
I think the way for luck to show its face is for you to be there, be participating, be ready, so that you can accept and take advantage of the luck.
yeah,
I think luck also, saying I was born lucky is also sort of my way of being modest,
right,
because I shouldn't be giving me all the credit. I mean, we've talked about my grandparents and my parents, right, and my children, and all of those things are part of why I've been lucky.
yeah. And have you read the book The Outliers?
No.
It's it's about high achievers like hockey players and then like Steve Jobs and people like that.
Uh-huh. Oh, yes. Uh-huh. I remember that. I remember the title now that you tell me the content.
And so it's an interesting book about this concept, right? That these people had some advantages and exposure to things that normal people didn't have, but they also took advantage of that and, like you said, like open the door. So there definitely is, you know, a an element of luck, right? I married Kevin. There was no indication that he would be successful when I married him. I mean, at the time, he was actually kind of a slacker in school and stuff, right? So that was just pure luck, although he was in engineering, which is funny how our family is very engineering based. Anyway,
Very mechanical and thoughtful and science based. Yes.
like there was no guarantee that he would have a career that would be successful at all. But he ended up kind of changing his outlook a little bit. And I mean, he's definitely taken advantage of situations presented to him too, right?
Exactly.
And he really worked towards what he wanted. And this concept of luck, it's a double-edged sword for me, because people say, oh, you're so lucky to be able to do what I do. But then they don't see all the work behind the scenes either. I mean, yes, there's a lot of luck that goes into it, right? That I was just born into this place and stuff. But I put a lot of effort into my kids, and I put a lot of effort into, building the family and the relationship with Kevin and these dogs.
And your love of art.
Art. And I mean, also just, financially, we're very conscious of saving money and not being extravagant. We're comfortable, and we've achieved some goals we had in that respect. If you feel like there isn't any luck in your life, I mean, maybe, I don't know, keep an eye out for it, right? And take some opportunities. When I was called into the shelter with the feral dog case that got me involved in the feral dogs, I could have said no. I could have said, I don't have experience with those dogs. I could have said any number of things. But instead I said, what the heck, right? Let me go up and see, because I was curious. And then when I met them and I realized I didn't have the skills I needed to help some of them, I took advantage of the network I had and asked around and see if someone could help me. So that was very proactive way of solving a problem, I think. Is one, I knew I needed help. And two, I reached out to get it. And then I took the knowledge I gained from Nelson coming out and experimented some with it, right? I hope people will maybe get a little confidence to experiment a little more. Not just with dogs, but, with other things by this story, right? By this podcast.
Well, as we talked about, I think the chances are good that it will have some impact. And I think the chances are good that those impacts will be positive. What's wrong with that?
Yeah. Yeah. And we're not like experts in this field or anything. We're just two people like sharing some experiences. So there's always that fear, like, oh, I'm not qualified to do this, or what do I know? Or, I don't have all the microphones and fancy stuff I need to do a podcast. And I don't know if this comes with age. Maybe you can speak on this, but, I've gotten to a point in my life where I'm like, well, I don't really care. I'm going to give it a try, because as you get older, you realize you don't have as much time you can't just keep delaying things, right? Because mortality pops up.
Well, yeah, but I think as you get older, you also have a thicker skin, so that you're not so worried about criticism, actually. And criticism isn't all bad, obviously, because it allows you to improve and it allows you to at least consider alternatives. You can always dismiss them,
right?
But if nobody presents them, then you never can consider them. So, criticism is positive, and as you get older, I find it's easier for you to dismiss criticisms and not be so concerned about them. In many ways, criticisms are limitations that are imposed on you by others, both intentionally and unintentionally. but it's always your option if you accept them, and you don't have to accept them. Yeah, I think you also start to recognize that you build your ego to the point where your armor is a little thicker. It's good fortune and some luck that allows you to do that. Obviously, all people don't reach those areas, and they may be even more successful than you might be, but they don't see it that way, and so they don't have that confidence sometimes.
Mm. Yeah, I guess so.
And this is, one of the end phases of my life. So, and it was done intentionally, actually, to focus more on the social issues of meeting, greeting, and knowing people. My career and this thing of moving around constantly, etc., has limited that in the past, and the extensive traveling that I did.
Oh, you didn't have any friends.
Well, I had friends, and they were good ones and they were close ones, but I didn't have a variety of social life.
Right.
So this move and this phase of our life is particularly focused on that, and it's turned out to be very successful, more than what we expected, actually.
Yeah, and I think, well, speaking as your child, I'm a little relieved some of the traveling has calmed down, because let's just say it wasn't just normal traveling on like a cruise, right? It was like seeing how cheap you could travel through India for 6 weeks, right?
Yeah.
And of course, that had us a little concerned as you got a little bit older.
Well, the good news is I survived.
Yeah, with only a
And
few.
there weren't many downsides. Oh yeah, a few worms that I had to have removed, but not bad.
But yeah, and you still like mountain bike like a fiend.
I
And
love mountain biking, yes. And but lately I've learned how to play mahjong, which is totally different than mountain biking. And I have taken up golf, which is challenging at my age. When most of your muscle memory is well in place, to insert new muscle memory is a challenge.
yeah, it gets all kinds of things working, huh?
Yeah, yeah. So, but it's fun. So those are the challenging things that keep opening those doors.
Yeah. Well, and you also, I mean, you're not just sitting around playing golf either. You're involved in these community talks you are doing, and what, outings for groups of people.
And yeah, we're working on the food and beverage section of our club to try to make it more profitable. Yeah, I got all kinds of little things going, in addition to a good relationship with my wife, fortunately enough,
Yeah.
and trying to deal with all the issues that face us as we grow older, which are generally unpleasant, but necessary.
Just have to turn those into opportunities somehow, Dad.
Yeah, well, we're trying to do that. Yeah, and generally it's working. And the downside is significant.
Right. Right. The risk is of not trying things is death, I suppose, huh?
I suppose that's the alternative. Yeah.
I mean, in a way, I think all this crazy activity you do, keeps you younger, like mentally, physically, right?
And even the same for you at your age is it's important to do the karate. It's important to do the feral dogs. It's important to do the workshop. It's important to, stop by the Grand Canyon and take a picture of you and your dog with that beautiful background.
Yeah.
Those are for you and Ken. I think this is an important part of your life. It's the same section that basically I did when I decided to do all of the traveling and see the world and, etc. It's valuable, and both of you are doing it well.
Yeah. What have dogs taught you, if anything? Because you haven't had a dog in 30
I
years?
haven't had a dog in 30 years,
So,
but I have plenty of grand dogs. I like dogs. I love dogs, as a matter of fact. But because of our lifestyle and various things, I just haven't had them in 30 years. And they certainly don't meet our lifestyle now either, in my opinion.
Right.
But I have observed dogs all those times. And of course, with involvement in your activities, Julie, they've become interestingly, I've actually thought more about dogs probably during this time than I would have as an owner, because you've stretched my curiosity with all of your efforts and work. But I mean, the dogs, of course, are famous because of the unconditional love thing. And I think they still supply that reliable companionship. You know, they never have a headache when their owner needs them. And they meet you at the door with zeal. And there's no other family member that does that, generally speaking.
That's true.
So, and I think one of the key issues is dogs are always ready to accept love, and all humans aren't that way. Sometimes they're not available. Sometimes they really don't care. But dogs are already there, always there, when somebody needs to hug them or somebody needs to just really love something.
Well, and of course, you've been around a lot of dogs I've fostered that really you can't hug or love on right away. So,
Well, that's one of the key things about your work is you're interested in allowing those dogs to also have a contribution. But it takes extra work to accomplish that. But the average dog owner, of course, doesn't go there. At best, they realize your work by adopting one of those dogs, but they really don't have much of an opportunity to appreciate what you have to go through to get them to that position. But the other thing about dogs is, in my 77 years, there has been an evolution of dogs. Not so much genetically, although with a lot of the hybrids and things like that, of course, we've also accelerated that evolution artificially. Dogs have moved from the yard to the house.
yeah.
I like to think, right? They've moved from being an adjunct family member to being an actual family member in many cases. The expectation of dog owners, I think, is that, which also changes. It means that not only is the dog living in the house, but the owner wants them to live in the house. So it's a very compatible situation. It's obvious that it is valuable to the owner in many ways, and there's lots of articles about it, and I don't propose to be an expert on it, but it's just a casual observer would know that. I think family members nowadays spend more time with the dog than they do other family members in many ways, in many cases. I mean, especially if you take the issues of taking your dog for a walk, all the activities you deal with during the day, it gives you the chance to spend 5 minutes here with a dog, 6 minutes here with a dog. The dog has really taken, like I said, to become a regular family member. And the other thing about that, as I see it, is capitalism has really stepped in to benefit from this evolution.
Yes.
Right? Toys, clothes, grooming, and medical care.
Yeah.
Over my 77 years has amazingly changed relative to the expectation of owners and dogs.
Yes. Well, and actually our rescue often gets donations from pet stores of things they didn't sell during, certain seasons. And it's just crazy the excess waste that's generated by that as well. I don't think people realize they don't sell a lot of things. And then we get Halloween costumes donated to us, for example. We can't even use those, right? Yeah, that's an interesting point. The capitalism, I think, has realized the market.
Oh yeah. And like we said, in a huge variety, a spectrum, all the way from sophisticated medical care down to toys and things like that. And the other observation is this: the hybrids, the advantages and disadvantages that brings, and some of the points that you've made about it's obsoleting basically the true dog, who is by definition a variety of genetic makeups, and it narrows it down to dogs that are being made for a purpose, and they're made for marketing. They're made for people to want them. It's not unlike using machinery to make a new product. And basically, while that may have some benefit, it's also potentially has some negatives, pointed out some in some of your articles, as a matter of fact. And that's the way it's going. I don't see it reversing at all. In fact, I think the more people have dogs, the more hooked they are on the capitalism part of it, and satisfying those dogs, and giving them what they think are gifts, like people would have emotional ties with accepting gifts.
Yeah.
I suppose dogs do in some way or another, but it's sort of odd how owners project human qualities to dogs. And by projecting that human quality to dogs, they see and they see that behavior, and it feeds a myth. And the fact is, they aren't human. They don't realize things that a human would respond to. They actually are a bit different. Humans like to see dogs as human-like. They've really done a great job of having a presence in the family at this point. And sure, they were always, even 77 years ago, there were very elite people who always had these, lap dogs and the cuties and that kind of thing. But it's moved now down to the expectation of the average American and the average elite worldwide population, actually. The way dogs are treated, to your point, sometimes the excess of how dogs are treated, it fulfills a function of the human who owns them, I think, and what they think both society and they want to do. That is the human.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's sort of deep, and I think it's a simple matter that people love dogs, and they want to do everything they can to, generally speaking, to feel like they're being good owners.
Yeah. I mean, dogs have always been a status symbol in some circles, but I think now they're becoming more of a status symbol for certain types. And
I agree. That's well said.
That's not just where you live. It's here too. People buy some kind of purebred dog and it's cute as a puppy. And then when it gets big and unruly, it ends up at the shelter. But they want that status symbol of having that breed or that image, right? How have dogs changed from when you lived in Kentucky? You guys had a dog, right?
Sure,
wasn't it
all the
named
time.
Brownie?
Oh yeah, Brownie. Yes, that's right.
Very creative name. I'm sure it was Brown.
Yes, of course.
But I know the dogs lived outside.
Right. And the best they had was Brownie would always have a run, for example, because Brownie was a male and he loved to leave and go wandering about.
Right.
And but they lived outside exclusively. Even you'd feed them outside normally. Now they'd come in only occasionally, and they stayed for small amounts of time. And I can't remember them wanting to stay inside, but I'm sure they did, especially on bad nights. But they had a typical doghouse and that kind of routine. And people enjoy having their dogs sleep with them on their furniture and those kind of things. And all of those have been evolution during my years. I mean, even if the dog came inside, there's no way they'd ever get up on the couch.
Okay.
At least unless they snuck up there when you wasn't expecting it. It's not that they didn't want up there, but they just weren't allowed up there.
And the vet care has helped with that. You know, they don't have fleas and worms and things like that anymore, which was probably
Good
pretty
point.
back then.
Yeah, good point. You're absolutely right, and they're cleaner because they live indoors anyway, and that it's all moving very quickly, and the general public is accepting the movement and reinforcing it by wanting it and allocating a significant part of their disposable income to their pets.
Yeah. All right, cool. Well, that's a good answer. The capitalism, of course, you would think about that.
Yes, right.
Coming from a business point of view. Anything else you want to add? Any life lessons?
No, I think we've talked about all of them. Very well organized on your part. Thank you very much, and very enjoyable for me personally as an individual and as a father.
Yeah, well, thanks for being on a podcast and sharing your experiences and your outlook on life. I appreciate it.
You are entirely welcome. I'll look forward to the final results.
Thank you all for joining me and my dad for this podcast. Limitations are opportunities. I'm very grateful for what I have learned from both of my parents about perseverance, hard work, and also turning limitations into opportunities. I hope you'll join us next time. And if you're interested in learning more from me about fearful and feral dogs, I have a couple workshops coming up. In May, I'm teaching the Fearful Feral Dog Workshop for Canine Human Relationship Institute in New Mexico. It's truly a one-of-a-kind, unique opportunity to learn how to train fearful dogs right from the get-go. I'm also having a workshop in Boise, Idaho in June, and I also have several learning opportunities online. Please visit my website, hearttoheartcanine.com, to find out more.